And we begin in Geneva, Switzerland, where the first in a series of crunch talks between the United States and Russia aimed at breaking the impasse over Ukraine has begun. With the threat of Russian military action in eastern Ukraine stirring concern across Europe, American and Russian officials will try to find a diplomatic path to ease tensions and avoid the potential for bloodshed. Russia has in recent months amassed some 100,000 troops on its border with Ukraine. The US has warned Moscow of severe economic repercussion if it does decide to invade Ukraine. The talks revolve around the demands for security guarantees from Western powers that the Kremlin made in a diplomatic offensive late last year. So could these talks defuse the chances of a major war in Europe? And what happens if diplomacy fails? Well, for more on this, I have on the line from New York, Thomas Graham, a distinguished fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He was also special assistant to the president and senior director for Russia on the National Security Council staff from 2004 to 2007. Good to have you, Graham.
Good to be with you today.
Yeah. So can you just bring us to speed on what you expect from these talks? I mean, it's not just this one in Geneva. We've got 3 of these talks. These followed by that in Brussels and all of that. So can you just bring us to speed on what we should be expecting from these talks?
Well, I think we need to remember that these are just initial talks, and both sides have said they're exploratory talks. The goal out of the session in Geneva today for both sides is to see whether there is a basis for further negotiations on what are the major concerns of each side. For the Russians, they're looking for some indication that the United States is prepared to address what they say are their serious security concerns. These largely revolve around questions of NATO expansion and the deployment of American military forces close to Russia's borders. For the United States, of course, the real issue here is whether Russia's serious about negotiating an effort to defuse the tensions around Ukraine and beyond that, along the entire NATO-Russia frontier, which stretches from the Arctic Ocean through the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea region. So both sides have downplayed expectations for today. No one expects a breakthrough. What could be the best outcome from today is a decision on both sides that these talks were valuable, they need to be continued. That will happen in Brussels on January 12th and Vienna on January 13th. But it's very important that there be an agreement to have an additional round of bilateral US-Russian talks.
These talks are actually being described as a late attempt to avert a war on Europe's eastern flank. And you could actually see Vladimir Putin trying to put himself into a position of bringing out demands that can actually not be fulfilled by both the US and its allies. What do you make of those demands yourself?
Well, the demands are extreme at this point. And my understanding is that people in Moscow understand that they have issued demands that cannot be met by the United States nor the NATO alliance. That said, I still think that in the Kremlin, they understand that there are tremendous risks associated with a military operation against Ukraine. Not only the bloodshed that would occur inside Ukraine, the casualties that Russian forces would take, but as we know, the United States and its NATO allies and partners have indicated that if there is a military operation, there will be serious economic and technological sanctions levied against the Russians. So I think the Kremlin is taking this all on board. I think their first goal is to pursue this through diplomacy. And I think the hope is that out of today's discussion, we will get an agreement on both sides that it is worthwhile continuing down the diplomatic path for at least some time.
Now, let's relate this to what is going on in Kazakhstan. We can actually see Russia coming to the aid of that country and the leaders actually seeking for Russia's support. Now, in all of this, do you think that Europe's allies will be able to stand alongside with them to protect Ukraine if a similar thing was to happen?
Well, you know, the administration has made a tremendous effort to rally the support of its NATO allies over the past several months. There have been extensive consultations at the working level, at the highest levels. My understanding is that there is a great deal of solidarity within the NATO alliance at this point. Yes, to be sure, there are different, I think, views on some of the tactics that should be pursued at this point. But I think overall, on the strategic thrust of the response to any Russian military action against Ukraine, there is actually unanimity among the NATO allies. And I would expect there to be a strong response in event, as I said, of a Russian military action against Ukraine.
And I would have really loved you to actually relate this with what's going on in Kazakhstan. The potential for Russia to protect its former Soviet republics, and then the demand by this same Russia for some of these former republics, Soviet republics that are already in NATO, to actually come back home. What do you make of that relationship?
Well, you know, the situation in Kazakhstan is significantly different from what we see in Ukraine at this point. Ukraine really is a case of a country where there has emerged a consensus that the country should move westward, and they're focused on their relations with the European Union. They're focused on their relationship with NATO, and Russia does see this as a significant security challenge. Ukraine moving away from Russia's orbit, a place where it's been for the past several hundred years. With Kazakhstan, what we have a different situation now, an internal instability that emerged out of some mistaken steps by the Kazakhstan government, complicated, I think, by an internal struggle within Kazakhstan over who would be running the top show. And that has led to the widespread violence we've seen in Kazakhstan over the past week. The Kazakhstan president himself invited the Russian forces in as part of the Collective Security Treaty Organization. The Russians readily agreed. I think this is a way both of stabilizing the situation in Kazakhstan from the standpoint of the Kremlin, but also of reasserting Russian influence in that country. And that, I think, is part of a broader effort by President Putin to reassert Russian authority throughout the former Soviet space. He has had some success over the past year, but I think the real sticking point still is Ukraine, and that is the area where most eyes are focused in coming weeks.
Now, Graham, I'm very much interested in knowing why Putin has this expansionist agenda, like some people have said. I mean, you've had these countries, Latvia, Lithuania, and all of that, all being former Soviet republics, but going to seek NATO protection. All this while, Russia wasn't able to do so much. But Putin is asking that these talks must put that 1997 earlier agreement on the agenda. That is to ensure that NATO doesn't go beyond that 1997 agreement that was initially there. Do you think that is feasible? I mean, can this still happen? We're in 2022.
No, I think that is an unrealistic expectation. There is no possibility that NATO is going to agree to return things to where they were in 1997. A lot has happened since then. As you know, there have been several rounds of NATO expansion. NATO expanded in part because the countries of Central and Eastern Europe were concerned about their security, and particularly concerned about what the policies would be of Russia as it regained its strength in the 2000s and 2010. So I don't see that happening. I think the real question here is whether the United States and NATO can come to some sort of agreement with Russia as to how NATO will act in the future, whether there will be expansion into the territories of the former Soviet space, Ukraine specifically, followed by Georgia and perhaps some others. Here, I think there's some grounds for negotiation that will satisfy some of Russia's security concerns, but at the same time not violate NATO's principles. Everybody understands that Ukraine is not ready for NATO membership in the near term. And so I can see there being some sort of agreement that NATO will not accept Ukraine as a member for a certain period. That may be sufficient to deal with some of Russia's immediate concerns. At the same time, NATO is not going to say that Ukraine can never join, but it's in the future many, many years away from now. And on the basis of this, it may be able to find a temporary solution, as I said, that meets Russia's minimal security needs at this point, but doesn't violate NATO's principles that the alliance is open to membership by other European countries.
Just very quickly before I let you go, Graham, do you think war is imminent considering the strongman tactics being used by Putin? Do you foresee a war and a breakdown in talks that may eventually lead to that war?
I don't believe that war is imminent at this point. I think Russia has used the buildup of military forces along the border with Ukraine to force these discussions that we see unfolding at this point. It wants the West, the United States in particular, to address what it sees as very serious security concerns. But as I've already indicated, there are serious risks involved with a military operation. I think the Kremlin is aware of that. I think that they would like to avoid a military operation. They want to see where they can go on the diplomatic track. That will be the preference over the next several weeks and months, I would hope. But I think that at the end of the day, the goal is to achieve the results without the use of military force.
All right, thank you so much, Thomas Graham, a distinguished fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations in the United States. We must thank you for joining us to take a look at this critical issue, and we just hope that a war is averted because the world already has so much problem.